Peace to my 6 to 22 strand, 7 to 9 ether, you melanin selenium base, black gods of this planet. As anybody that's tuning in, that's familiar with mind ascension, I'm gonna go places where most people probably don't go. And once again, to me, it's imperative that as a people, as a 9 ether, you melanin based people, aka known as black people, you know, it's important that we redefine definitions, we redefine terms. It's important that we take control of what seems to indoctrinate our subconscious mind and give false narratives and definitions to each other, allowing us to feel justified within our dismissals and our behaviors towards each other. Because a lot of times our behavior, including violence, including domestic violence from both sides, is justified by false foundations given to us by invaders in the first place, as well as a form of osmosis of adopting these traits and these, what I like to call recessive infections that have been bestowed upon us by our invaders. Let me ask you, when it says somebody's entering a room, do I have to do anything? Do I have to admit them or anything like that? Okay, so just ignore that stuff, right? All right. Now, once again, if anybody's aware of mind ascension, I deal in what I like to call 3 keys: source knowledge, divine ascension, and infinite expansion. Source knowledge is basically anything that you want to know, whether it's a religion, whether if you want to be a Christian, no problem. Utilizing intelligence, I ask you, what is the oldest book or the oldest source that you can find of what you think is the word of God, and why are you not following that? Source knowledge is dealing with the aspect of digging as far as you can until there's nothing left to dig for, and starting with that as a foundation, utilizing the intelligence to come to a conclusion based on what you're going to choose now to believe, based on what usually should be some type of fact. Unfortunately, many of us are not using that. Divine ascension is about the fact that you are recognizing yourself as a divine being, and you are constantly ascending to a state of divinity within mind and body and your actions and your thinking. And infinite expansion just means you never stop nowhere. I don't care how comfortable you get with any study. I don't care how comfortable you get with any culture. If you truly do see divinity as a goal, then you should not stop in any culture, any box, any study. You should master that study and move on to the next one after that, because that's what this cycle of life is about, accumulating as many lessons as possible until we are no longer needed here by purpose, and now we transcend to another state of form or another state of existence beyond this human encasement and imprisonment that we call a body. So starting with that, I just want to give a quick understanding of how crazy I am, and that I will be going into certain things that many probably never even heard before. Now, when we start out with these terms, domestic violence, when we start out, now history is a word that always makes me go as far out as I possibly can. When I hear his story, when I hear history, to me, I consider myself to be an historian based on the fact that everything you possibly want to know is locked in history. Math is locked in history. Architecture is locked in history. Anthropology and culture is locked in history. The records of sexuality is locked in history. Everything is locked in history in some archaeological type of aspect that we can find if we choose to. So history has always been an obsession with me and a love to me and a companion to me. And I give great respect for it. And unfortunately, history has been distorted to such an extent we have to do true due diligence to separate certain aspects and go a little bit further beyond just only the European source that unfortunately dominates this planet. Now, as I just mentioned, source knowledge, one thing that comes with my personal ideology and my personal teachings and that is connected to source is universal laws. Now, one thing within universal laws, or 2 things, I should say, 2 laws out of the 7 is polarity and gender. The reason I'm mentioning this is because when we talk about domestic violence in history, we're basically talking about the distortion of the polarities of energy that coincide with gender. Because when you have a patriarchal system, when you have a homosexual society, by the law of polarity, which dictates the energy, you are going to have some type of over extreme abuse or subjugation or pressure or what's the other word I'm looking for? Suppression of the feminine energy from the masculine energy, when the masculine being force and the feminine being the receiver or the sustainer. So I think it's very important that when we start utilizing these terms, when we bring up the history of violence and domestic violence and so on and so forth, we always must take in consideration the period, the region, okay, and the people that we're referring to at that time. We must also discern who they are compared to who we are, because unfortunately our Black woman has absorbed the historical context of another being that is not even capable of being on her level in any aspect at all. And by absorbing that narrative and absorbing that history that is only, how would you say, subjected to one type of species of graftation or amalgamation. Now, when I say that, I'm referring to the white woman who is a recessive genetic. And if we take it a little bit further beyond our social beliefs, a graftation, and then we also have the amalgamation. The amalgamation is those who were raped by the recessive genetic and who are mixed with the indigenous peoples of whatever region raped by the recessive genetic, which I will go into, who are now amalgamated through centuries and generations of what's called inbreeding. And now you have your Arab, you have all your Southern Europeans who have brown eyes and brown hair, but of course they are still honorary white people. And you have these different forms of groups around the so-called Mediterranean, the so-called Middle East. I don't know what the hell that is, but for lack of terms that I can't use without people directly relating to it. And these groups that have genetically mixed with an already recessive gene have taken on traits, attributes, and glandular structures within the brain that dictates the behavior that we now are being taught is normal to us, but that has no record and has no depictions and no archaeological connection to our multiple lands on this planet, which is owned by us. Where do we begin? You know, anytime we want to start on anything, I find it interesting how many of us start in the convenient place for ourselves. We like to start in time frames that fit our direct agenda. We like to start in time frames that fit our direct feeling and personality. But Mind Ascension doesn't do that. I'm going to start the earliest that I can find evidence of abuse upon the female body and anatomy by what's called bioarchaeology. Bioarchaeologically. Hold up, let me make sure I get that word right. Bioarchaeologically, okay? Now, when we look at one place, which is called La Plata Valley, which is in the Americas, central to be exact, we find 66 bodies that were excavated. And within those 66 bodies, what makes these group of bodies important is that they relate to a specific village in a specific time that predates arrival of Europeans and so forth. We're talking about a prehistoric time. And out of the 66 bodies discovered, 6 of those bodies were women bodies, but that had evidence of basic domestic violence. We're talking about broken wrists. We're talking about bashed cranial skulls. Now, what's interesting about this site is as they dug further, utilizing the bio or biological archaeology, they come to find out that these women and the connection of the bone marrow and blood discovered was actually connected most of the time to other women, meaning that at this time frame, not only were women in power and women were in rulership, but foreign women. Now, as we should understand, when we talk about totemic societies, prehistoric societies, there is a lot of clan rivalry, for lack of a better word. I don't like using that term clan, it's pretty derogatory, but there's a lot of group tribal rivalry. And many of these tribes, if not all of them at this time, were matriarchal. They were ruled by women. So what these excavationists had discovered was that the other 60 bodies, which were both men and women, the ones that were connected to the damaged bodies were actually of female anatomy as well, meaning that the ones buried haphazardly with their bodies distorted, and not distorted as mutilation, but basically like they were just thrown into a grave, it's assumed that they were of a lower class of women within that group, and the higher class of women basically, how would you say, abused them or rectified them, which we can find in a more fast forward, not even contemporary, but during the 1800s, what was called the Casual Killing Act, where the mistress of the slave master would beat the women to death because they knew out of spite that the slave master was sleeping with these black slaves or these black women. So it's called Casual Killing Act. If you look that up, I believe it was in 1781, something of that nature. And it was basically a law to protect white women after they would murder black slaves and black male and female slaves for whipping them so bad and punishing them so bad that they would end up killing them casually. Now, back to La Plata Valley to be exact. You can look this up. They find cranial damage with relation to the hands of other female anatomy and specimens. Now, my point is, the further you go back in time on this planet, the closer you get to a matriarchal system where not only was woman worship, but woman was also the enforcer of law. Excuse me, she was the giver of law. Man was only a tool to enforce the law. Not only that, but when you go back to totemic societies, and you can find this in a book called Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man by Albert Churchward, it tells you that in the totemic society, which if you look up totemic, this is a pre-dynastic society. This goes before Egypt, before Mesopotamia, before all of this. The mother of that totemic clan was the leader and was the dictator of all rulership within that clan. And because she had the purest blood that was connected to the land, all men were not only servant to her, but they also had to come out of her bloodline, meaning that she only had sex with her kin. Now, I know today that's a big hot topic when we talk about incest, but I'm sure any of us who are even slightly educated on certain history, we know that the ancient pharaohs, it was very common for the royal family to practice incest to purify the blood, but I'm getting off subject. Now, during these totemic times, women were the law givers and men were utilized as the guards to enforce the law. The same way that we use the police force, the same way that we use the army. The difference is when we think about contemporary times and also historical times, we keep superimposing this European concept that it was all men doing this, that it was men enforcing torture, which, by the way, there is no evidence. That's another thing I didn't even get to touch on. There is no evidence of torture outside of Europe, because torture devices, when you type in ancient torture devices, especially those used on women, because they have torture devices called the breast ripper, that was for ripping women's breast open. They have ancient torture devices that actually split, please pardon the vulgarity or the extremity of my descriptions, but they have ancient torture devices that split women in half through their vagina. These were only found exclusively to Europeans. You do not find any ancient torture devices outside of Europe. And they always go to the middle so-called Middle Ages and so on and so forth, and so-called Dark Ages, which they like to conveniently change the name to Middle Ages. Now, Let's go from La Plata Valley, which is one of our oldest archaeological digs that find evidence of cranial damage of women due to domestic violence, which they connected to majority of this domestic violence actually being connected to other women in power abusing lower class women. Let's go further up, but still stay in ancient times with laws called Enemetina and Yuka Gina. Yoruka Gina. Enemetina, Enemetena, and Urukagina. Now, these are called Yoruka Gina cones. On these cones, 2400 BC are the first codes and laws that are documented, so-called, of all the world. Now, of course, we know that Ma'at and the negative confessions and all these things come long before this, but of course, when we utilize Europeans, we utilize something that they seem to always want to say they are, because I'm about to go into Hammurabi codes after this, and they try to say that those are the oldest codes, and those come after the codes I'm talking about now. So every time you deal with Europeans, you always got to be very careful, because they love to say this is the oldest, but then you turn around and find something older than that, and then they call that the oldest, and then you find something older than that, and then they call that the oldest. Now, of course, they love to acknowledge Greece and Mesopotamia as the oldest and most advanced civilization, which of course we know is false and not necessarily true. But let's go into one of these codes, because I don't have time to go into everything, because when you go into the Hammurabi and the Yoruka Gina codes, they go into the hundreds and to the 200s of codes. Just one of the first codes that pop up when you type in Yoruka Gina cones, the first thing that pops up is, if a woman speaks out of term, her teeth shall be smashed in with a brick. We're just getting started, y'all. We're just getting started. Now, we're talking about 2400 BC, and we're talking about codes implemented by the region of people that today is referred to as the Middle East. Now, if we have any historical aspect of this region of the world, we understand that they were dominated by Assyrians, so-called Akkadians, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, we're dealing with steppes, Ukrainian peoples that came down from the mountains and began to rape and pillage the indigenous people of these lands. One of them being the Akkadians, which gets confused. And of course, they go into India and then they create what's called the Untouchables, the Dravidians, and so on and so forth. Now we're going into 2000 to 1000 BC. Now, like I said, Enemetina and Urukagina cones is an archaeological stone cone. It's a physical stone cone with codes inscribed all around the cone, going all the way down to the base. And one of the first codes is, if a woman speaks out of term, her mouth must be bashed in, her teeth must be broken in by stone or brick. Just to give you an idea of the type of people we're dealing with. Let's go into the Hammurabi codes, because the Hammurabi codes of 1754 BC seem to be a little bit more popular and more well-known than the codes I just mentioned that predate the Hammurabi codes. Now, when you look up the Hammurabi codes, HAMMURABI, they will tell you that these are the oldest codes. And I just showed you another code that was older than that goes back to 2400 BC. Now, in the Hammurabi code, a woman who chooses to go into a wine shop or open a wine bottle can be burned to death. In the Hammurabi code, a woman who does not fulfill her wifely duties, meaning cleaning of the house, as well as if she belittles her husband, shall be drowned to death. These are laws implemented upon women in what we refer to today as Mesopotamia or Babylon. And basically, you couldn't sip on y'all wine like y'all love to today, because you might burn to death. You couldn't go gift the gab and go, how would you say, gossip to your lady friends about the terrible things your husband was doing to you, because that was called belittlement. And then they had the right to throw you in a river and drown you. Another code that they instituted was when a woman, now this is under Assyrian law, by the way, a woman could be executed immediately for a number of certain things. Adultery was execution viable, the execution validated. Abortion was execution validated. So basically, if you lost, let's say you were a woman and your husband beat you till you lost your child, you would be executed for aborting that child. Because we're talking about time frames where you're not going to a clinic. We're talking about time frames where you can have a miscarriage, and that miscarriage is your fault. We're talking about time frames where you could be abused and lose your baby, and the losing of your baby is your fault, and you will be executed by death. Now, here's my favorite one. Here's my favorite one of the Hammurabi / Assyrian laws. If a man is accused of a crime, he has the right to put his wife in place of his punishment. So basically, if I mess some nonsense up and I do something against the same laws of the land that I live amongst, I can go, you know what? That sounds a little harsh. Why don't you flog my wife instead? And the so-called courts of that time would find that a valid claim or a valid thing to do. All right. Now, once again, I don't want to go into every single one of these codes because there's literally over 200 of them, and they all deal with things that, because during this time, they did not believe in accidents. So anything that was a so-called accident was actually included by law as deliberate. So one of the codes that's in the Hammurabi Code is if a man builds a house for another man, and for some reason that house collapses on that man and kills that man, then that man will be slain for killing that man by the structure of that house. Now, let's stay within this time frame and let's go to Mosaic laws. Now, these are laws instituted by the so-called Hebrew faith or the so-called Jewish, which we know are nothing but Ashkenazi, Khazarian, converts. Now, one law I found quite interesting that I came across very long ago in a great book called Ancient Future that everyone should get their hands on is that during the time of this Hebrew law, in these Mosaic laws of Moses, whatever they would like to term it, if a woman was raped, in order to prove she was raped, not only did she need 4 different witnesses to witness the rape, 3 wasn't enough, 2 wasn't enough, 1 wasn't enough. If you didn't have 4 witnesses that witnessed your rape by another man, then guess what? You had to marry that man. So you had to marry your rapist if you only had 3 witnesses to your rape. Great stuff. Now, once again, we're talking about European and Middle Eastern regions of the ancient world. And when you type in global ancient history of abuse, they don't even touch Africa. Africa's not even named. And what I find so interesting about these Europeans is they love to call something world history, but they never leave Eurasian continent. They never leave Europe. They don't leave Europe, and they don't leave certain parts of the Middle East. And I find that very interesting because they love saying world history. They love saying global history, but they stay on one continent. One continent. And when they do seem to go off to another continent, it's never specifically clear, and there's not records. There's only a form of anthropological or osteological, which dealing with the bones evidence. Even though there's plenty of pottery that I have shown on my page, there's plenty of pottery, plenty of depictions showing the natural life in the common life of those people where there is no violence against women within that pottery or within that archaeological evidence. Now, as I said, the so-called Hebrew converts under Mosaic law, a woman that was raped had to marry her rapist if she did not have enough witnesses to prove it was rape. Because by their logic, any man that has sex with a woman, basically, it was like her choice, and, you know, she chose the man, and in order to make it right, she had to marry that man under law. One more thing I want to add about the Hebrew so-called faith is that they do not recognize you as a Jew if your mother is not Jewish. Now, I want to remind all of us that all of these peoples in these regions are actually copying ancient African and indigenous people's way of life and distorting it with their own patriarchal, homosexual basis of their hate for women. So they take a common practice, which is giving rulership and kingship through mother's bloodline, or the totemic practice of giving clanship and chieftain prowess through the clan mother bloodline. They adopt that part, but then suppress the women altogether within their region. Now, we talked about La Plata Valley. We talked about the Urukagina cones. We talked about the Hammurabi codes. We talked about the Assyrian laws. Let's go into Nile Valley for a second, because it's quite interesting that when we bring up the topic of domestic violence and violence against women, despite the fact that Nile Valley has over 10,000 years of recorded record in stone, in monument, in papyri, all these different recordings that actually by far are more abundant than any other culture and civilization on the planet, which is why I personally love utilizing ancient Egypt, not because I think it is the best or because whatever anybody might think. It's because they have such an extensive record of everything that went on within that area and point in time. So it is the most referable aspect of history that we can find when we want to connect ourselves to something that we are saying is common to all people or all men. Now, the first thing we discover when we go down 10,000 years of Nile Valley civilization, of course, starting from the cataracts of southern Nubia, going all the way from the southern tip of Africa, going up to the north, which is reversed, by the way, unfortunately, by the European, because because the south really is the upper and the north really is the lower. But we find that the very first gods worshipped, the very first laws implemented were worshipped and implemented by female deities, one being Ma'at and one being Heteru, who the Greeks referred to as Hathor. Now, Heteru is considered one of the oldest gods to be worshipped, or goddess, I should say. Even that term is very Greek. So sometimes sometimes you would hear me say gods and not even acknowledge the goddess aspect, because to me, a god is a woman, period. She gives birth to kings, queens, and gods and deities. So she is the primordial god. And we can even go into the primordial waters of Noon, which is the feminine aspect of the dark waters that gave birth to Atum. So we're still talking about the watery substance of the void, which is the yoni, which is the womb, which is the vagina. And through that womb, throughout that watery substance and black waters, which is the triple blackness of the third trimesters within the womb, which is why the waters of Noon are referred to as the chaotic black waters, because simultaneously we are talking about the triple blackness of gaseous melanin matter of space, which you can say is a black hole, which is a yoni and a vagina, and it is being imposed or anthropomorphized into a woman named Nunet or Noon, who is the chaos waters that gave birth to Atum and Ra.